You should turn in a blank sheet, the examiner whispered. This is for the gifted track. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a tired analog clock on the back wall, the kind that still hung in old public schools with yellowed walls and metal blinds that never quite closed. Miles Carter sat at the far corner of the testing hall. His chair was slightly wobbly, one leg shorter than the others. He balanced it with his foot without looking. He had never been in this part of the building before. The shower. Middle school students were allowed into the high school annex only during testing season. This was the placement exam for the advanced mathematics program at Linwood Regional High, the most competitive public high school in the region. The test was known for one thing. It was meant to filter, not to invite, 90 minutes. 3 problems, each designed to test abstract reasoning beyond grade level. Most students never finished more than one. It was not multiple choice. It was proof-based. Miles looked around. The others had already flipped their paper's pencils, moving like busy insects over the page. They had trained for this. Some came from private tutors. Some had older siblings in the program. He had only his mother, Naomi, and the quiet blackboard she bought at a garage sale for $5 where he scribbled at night. He turned his test paper over slowly. Each problem was typed clearly in large serif font. Problem 1 was a geometry proof that asked for a derivation involving inscribed angles. Problem 2 introduced a number sequence and asked for a general form using modular congruence. Problem 3 was a theoretical question involving symmetry in directed graphs. Miles stared. He did not fully understand any of them. The numbers were familiar. The words were not. He read again slower this time, mouthing the words like a song without melody. Something moved in his head, a texture more than a thought. He flipped the page over. The back was blank. He lifted his pencil and began to draw. A small circle. Then another inside the first. Then a set of curved lines that spiraled out like a shell, each loop connected to a dot. A number appeared next to each one. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, Fibonacci. But the loops were not in a straight line. They curved back inward, some touching, some not. He shaded lightly between them, forming shapes like petals. Each spiral was symmetrical yet shifted. The pattern obeyed no grid, but it felt right, like gravity was guiding his hand. He did not stop to think. He just kept drawing. The examiner, a tall man in a beige suit with a clipped beard, walked slowly between the rows. He stopped at Miles' desk, glanced down, and frowned. "Son," he whispered again. "Are you trying the problems?" Miles looked up quietly. "Yes, sir." He returned to his sketch. The minutes passed. The room was filled with scribbles, erasures, and sighs. Miles did not move except to rotate the paper as he drew. The spiral grew, expanding like a galaxy compressed into a sheet of white. When time was called, most students had half a page of writing. Some had full proofs. Miles had 3 lines of attempt on problem 1, then his drawing. He stood, handed the paper to the examiner, who looked at it, hesitated, and smiled politely, but not kindly. "Thank you," he said. "You can wait for your results in a few weeks." Miles nodded. He did not expect anything. He had tried his best. As he left the room, he looked back once. A few students were laughing quietly. One mimicked his spiral with a finger in the air. He walked down the hallway alone, past the trophies of math leagues and science fairs, past the framed photos of former valedictorians all smiling in caps and gowns. He did not know what he felt. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting light through the tall windows. Naomi was waiting at the gate in her janitor uniform, her hands still smelling faintly of bleach. She smiled at him and ruffled his hair. "How did it go, baby?" He shrugged. I did what I could. She nodded. That is all I ever ask. That night, while she cleaned classrooms, he sat again with the garage sale blackboard. He tried to redraw the spiral from memory. It came out different this time. The numbers changed slightly. The curves tightened. He added a small arrow at one of the junctions, then another. He saw something. A path away. The numbers moved not just forward but across, like a flowchart with no beginning. He wrote next to it, not a sequence. A field. He did not know what that meant yet, but it felt real. In the hallway, the janitor's cart rolled by, her radio playing faint jazz. Miles looked up, then back at the board. He erased the word field and wrote instead, just a drawing, but he kept the board standing. He knew he would return to it tomorrow. They called your mother in to tell her you were not capable. The next Tuesday, Miles and Naomi sat in a small office across from the assistant principal of Linwood Regional High, a man with a glossy nameplate and a wall of diplomas behind him. None of them looked touched or used. They were more like trophies than tools. Mrs. Carter, your son is very respectful and shows effort, the man began. But the mathematics program here is exceptionally rigorous, and unfortunately, his score fell below the required threshold. Naomi said nothing. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She had changed out of her work clothes and wore a faded church dress instead. He will be placed in the standard curriculum. Miles sat beside her, his eyes on the desk, not on the man. We understand, Naomi said quietly. Thank you for letting us know. As they rose to leave, a voice called out from the hallway, Miss Carter. It was Miss Ramirez, a young teacher with short curls and a canvas bag covered in math puns. She looked nervous but determined. Could I speak to you for a moment? They stepped into the hallway, Naomi and Miles waiting as Ramirez closed the office door behind them. I saw something, she said finally. I was walking past the testing room and saw the boy S-paper. It had a drawing on it, unlike anything I have seen in years. Drawing. Naomi echoed. You mean like art? Not exactly. It looked like a number field, a graphical mapping of an irrational function, or maybe even a Fibonacci overlay on a directed graph. I sent a photo of it to a friend of mine at MIT. MIT. Naomi blinked. Like the real one. Yes, said Ramirez. She is doing postgraduate work in theoretical number systems and algebraic geometry. She thought the image might be useful to her research. Miles looked confused. He had not thought about the drawing since that day. I would like to keep the paper for a while. Miss Ramirez added, just for study. I think it deserves attention. You can keep it, Naomi said. We have others at home. He draws them on the blackboard when he cannot sleep. Does he do that often? Almost every night. Miss Ramirez's eyes softened. Tell him not to stop. Miles did not speak the whole ride home. The bus windows fogged slightly with the late autumn mist. Naomi watched his reflection. He was thinking deeply, but not upset. Not angry, just inside himself. At home, he went straight to the board. That night, he drew not a spiral, but a branching path like a tree made of numbers, each limb splitting and curving, looping back in ways he could not explain. He began labeling parts, A1, B2, C5. Then he paused. He erased a whole section. He stared at it for a long time. Miles, Naomi called from the kitchen. Want rice or soup? Soup. He answered, still looking at the board. He added a note to himself next to the new sketch graph, with no return. Outside, the rain had begun soft and steady. The light from their small living room glowed against the dark window panes. Miles fell asleep on the couch, notebook still in hand. Meanwhile, Miss Ramirez sat in her apartment sipping tea, staring at the photograph of Miles' drawing she had emailed her friend. The reply had arrived that evening. "Who drew this?" The message said, "This pattern looks like a non-cyclic representation of a parity sequence mapped in 2 dimensions. We have been exploring similar structures using DAGs in our lab, but this variation seems intuitive, not computed. Is the author a grad student?" Miss Ramirez typed slowly back. "No," she wrote. "He is 13. Miss Ramirez stood before her class of 11th grade geometry students, holding the photocopied sketch that Miles had drawn. She had run it off that morning in the teacher's lounge, and now it rested in her palm like a question no textbook had answered. "All right," she said, holding it up before the whiteboard. "Anyone seen anything like this before?" The students leaned forward, squinting. A few shrugged. A boy in the second row adjusted his glasses and squinted again. "Looks like a kind of spiral," he offered. "Fibonacci, maybe. But it twists inward in ways the Fibonacci curve doesn't." Another student spoke. "That pattern at the edges looks modular, almost like residues grouped by class mod 7. "It's not on Desmos," one girl muttered after checking her phone. "It doesn't graph normally." "Exactly," said Ramirez. "That's why I wanted you to see it." This was drawn by someone who hasn't even studied Algebra 1 yet. "Who?" a voice asked. Ramirez smiled. "Someone from the middle school testing program. He didn't pass the written exam. But he left this." The students passed the sketch around. Some stared longer than others. There was something oddly meditative about the pattern. The loops that shifted but returned, the numbers embedded quietly at their nodes. "What's it supposed to show?" someone asked finally. "That's the thing," said Ramirez. "I don't know, but it reminds me of something from a research paper I read last year about parity logic on non-cyclic directed graphs. It's as if the child saw the shape of something we're still trying to describe in symbols." She paused. "And it came naturally to him." Later that day, she emailed her friend again. This time, she attached not only the original photo, but also some annotated student feedback from her class. The reply came back in less than 3 hours. "Where is this boy? Can I talk to him, please?" Miles was at home that evening, sketching a new variation using colored chalk borrowed from the art teacher at his middle school. He liked the way color helped him keep track of the directions. He called them branches, even though they twisted like vines. Naomi came in from her evening shift, carrying groceries in one arm and mail in the other. She placed a large envelope on the table. It bore a return address from Cambridge, Massachusetts. "MIT," Miles read out loud. Inside was a printed email with a note from Miss Ramirez and a small booklet of graph patterns, hand-drawn by doctoral students. "They want to know if you can talk about what you drew," Naomi said softly. Miles blinked. "Talk? About the drawing?" "Yes," said Naomi, "but only if you want to." He looked at his own chalk drawing, then back at the envelope. "Do they want me to fix it?" he asked. "No," Naomi said. "They want to understand it." Miles nodded slowly. He picked up the booklet, turned a page, then another. Some of the graphs looked like his. Some didn't. He pointed to one with a long spiral embedded in a square. "They're trying to flatten it," he said quietly. "Flatten what?" Naomi asked. "The circle." He went back to the blackboard. That night he didn't draw. He just stood there, staring at the loops already written there, as if he were waiting for them to speak first. "Who drew this? It looks exactly like a DAG model, but with an organic twist." It was a quiet Thursday evening when Miss Ramirez sat at her tiny kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee cooling beside her laptop. She had just finished grading papers and opened her inbox without much thought. But there it was, an email from her old grad school friend Lynn Tran, now a postdoc at MIT. Attached was the photo Ramirez had sent weeks ago, Miles' spiral drawing. The subject line just read, "Seriously." She clicked it open and read, "Who drew this? It looks exactly like our latest DAG simulations, but hand-drawn and intuitive. It even includes directional parity loops, the kind we only started modeling last semester." Ramirez leaned back in her chair, eyes wide. DAGs, directed. Acyclic graphs were typically the domain of advanced mathematics and computer science, not something a 13-year-old who never took algebra would sketch out by instinct. She replied quickly, "His name is Miles Carter. He is 13 years old and did not pass our advanced placement test. He just drew this during the exam instead." Lynn responded in less than 5 minutes. "Can you ask his parents if we can study more of his work? We are serious." The next day after school, Miss Ramirez visited Naomi at home. Naomi was folding laundry with a basket beside her, and Miles was sketching quietly on the floor. Ramirez sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. "I have something to show you," she said, gently. She showed Naomi the email trail, the questions, the astonishment in the language, MIT. Naomi repeated slowly, "That MIT." Ramirez nodded. "They want to know who your son is." Naomi's eyes softened. She looked down at Miles, then back at the screen. "He has been drawing things like that since he was 5, she said softly. "It started when we were living at a bus station shelter in Nebraska. We didn't have paper, so he used to draw with his finger on the wall paint. He said the shapes helped him fall asleep. Sometimes he would hum," Naomi added, "or close his eyes and move his finger through the air like he was tracing something invisible." Ramirez listened in silence, her hands still resting near the keyboard but unmoving. That night, after returning home, she sat in her apartment and wrote carefully to Lynn. "This child is not solving problems. He is speaking in a structure that does not rely on formal logic. It is as though he is thinking in pure topology, or perhaps something earlier, more internal." Lynn replied with a final line that stayed with her long after she closed her laptop. "Then he might be one of those rare minds not shaped by education, but by nature itself." Meanwhile, Miles continued drawing. He had no idea what MIT was or what DAGs meant. He only knew that the loops in his mind were returning, that they were getting clearer and somehow gentler. A few nights later, Miss Ramirez unlocked the school after hours and met Naomi and Miles near the maintenance wing. She didn't tell the math department. It was unofficial. Miles walked the quiet hallway behind his mother, the same hall he had taken during the exam weeks ago, the same exam he had failed. He stopped outside the testing room. "I want to see it again," he said quietly. Naomi looked at Ramirez, who gave a slow nod. Inside the room, Miles sat at the same desk, opened a blank page, and placed it next to his old drawing, the one he now called the seed, and he began again. "I only draw like this when I cannot sleep," Miles whispered. The school hallways were dark and quiet. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and the maintenance wing was the only part of the building still lit. Naomi was finishing her shift, mopping the tiled floor outside the library. Her son followed quietly behind, carrying his notebook and a box of chalk. "You sure about this?" she asked, one hand resting on the handle of her cart. He nodded. "I want to see the room again." Ramirez had gotten permission under the radar to let them in one more time just for the evening. It was unofficial. Nobody from the math department knew Naomi used her key. The testing room was colder than Miles remembered. The desks had been rearranged for regular classes now, but he found the one he had used and sat in it silently. He took out the drawing he had called the seed and placed it beside a blank sheet. Miss Ramirez watched from the doorway. Her breath slowed as she saw him settle in the chair with the quiet certainty of someone who had waited for this moment to return, not for glory, but for peace. No timer, no exam, just a quiet room. Miles began with a dot, then curved a line slowly outward, then inward. The pattern unfolded with rhythm, not calculation. Miss Ramirez walked closer and saw that he was reconstructing the inner loops from his previous sketch, but with sharper bends, tighter junctions. "You said you only draw like this when you cannot sleep," she said gently. He nodded. "When do you sleep?" "When the lines are quiet again." Naomi smiled faintly from the doorway, pulling her sweater close against the chill. They stayed in the room for nearly 2 hours. Miles drew and then paused and then drew again. He made no effort to explain anything. He seemed not to be performing at all. It was private but not secret. Miss Ramirez noticed something new. Each spiral or segment he added had a small annotation, a single letter, sometimes two, occasionally a tiny arrow. "What are those?" she asked. Miles paused. "Labels. They help me remember what each line means when it shifts, like coordinates. No, like moods. Miss Ramirez blinked. Moods. Yes, he said. Like this curve is anxious, so it turns quickly. This one is tired, so it flattens out." "It sounds like music," Naomi murmured from the doorway. Miles smiled. Music without sound. Ramirez felt goosebumps, but said nothing. She simply nodded and watched as the child continued to give language to a world he seemed to live inside. Outside the classroom, the janitor cart squeaked. Naomi stepped out to retrieve something and left the door slightly ajar. That was when the door at the far end of the hallway opened and a figure in a gray blazer stepped through. It was Mr. Granger, head of the math department. "What is going on here?" he asked sharply. Ramirez stepped forward quickly. "Just a quiet session, nothing official." Granger peered into the room, saw Miles bent over the paper. "What is he doing in here?" "He is not enrolled." Ramirez kept her voice calm. "He is not disturbing anyone. This room is for instruction, not for art therapy," Granger snapped. "It is not art therapy," said Ramirez softly. "It is mathematics." Granger walked in, snatched the paper from the desk, and held it up, squinting. This is what you call math." He turned to Naomi. "You let him in here." Naomi stepped inside slowly. "That is my son. I am not ashamed of where he sits or what he sees." Granger scoffed. "The standards here are not optional. This school has a reputation." Ramirez met his eyes cold and steady. "Perhaps our reputation is what keeps us from seeing what is right in front of us." Granger threw the paper back on the desk. "I will be reporting this." He turned and left, his footsteps echoing loudly. Naomi knelt beside her son, who had not moved. "I am sorry, baby." Miles did not look up. "It is okay. I still see it in my head." Miss Ramirez picked up the drawing and looked at it once more before folding it gently and slipping it into her bag. "Let them report it," she said. "I already sent it to someone who wants to understand, not control." Naomi exhaled slowly and gathered her things. "Come on, sweetheart." They walked down the empty hallway, together side by side. Back in the room, one piece of chalk still lay on the floor. Faint green dust around it like the tail of a comet that had passed quietly through the lives of those who had forgotten how to look up. The next morning, Miles stayed home from school. He was not sick, but Naomi could see in his silence that he was tired. Tired in the kind of way sleep could not touch. He sat at the table drawing in a small notebook. Lines tight and folded like rope under tension. Naomi poured him tea. Though he never drank tea, she just needed something to do with her hands. By midday, a knock came at the door. Ramirez stood on the porch, a folder under her arm and concern in her face. "They want to speak with me," she said quietly. "The school board about last night." She nodded. "I am not sure how serious it is yet, but they are calling it a violation of policy. Unsupervised student activity. Use of restricted space." Naomi looked past her into the quiet street. The laundry she had hung out that morning, already dry from the sun. "I should not have let him go in," she said softly. Ramirez shook her head. "No, he should have always been allowed in. That is the point." The board meeting was held in the staff conference room, a space too small for all the judgment it contained. Mr. Granger sat at the far end, arms crossed as Ramirez stood before the small panel of district officials. "He is not a student at this school," one of them said flatly. "No," she replied, "but he is a student." "That distinction matters," said another. "He was drawing, not disrupting. And if every child who failed the exam asked to return for a personal drawing session." Ramirez said nothing. Granger tapped his pen loudly. "If we reward failure with attention, we weaken the standards. This is not a charity. It is a program for excellence." "And what if excellence does not look like you expected?" Ramirez replied. They asked her to step out while they discussed. Outside, Naomi waited, pacing quietly in the hallway. Miles sat beside her feet, not touching the floor. They came back with a warning, a letter in her file. Any further unauthorized activity would result in disciplinary review. But they said nothing about Miles, because he is not a student. That night, Naomi received an email from France. A professor who had seen the institute drawing had forwarded it to his department at the Sorbonne. It read, "We believe this young mind is approaching primitive representations of higher dimensional parity theory. We would like to request permission to include this work in our spring conference exhibit on abstract numerical cognition." Miles read the message aloud, then looked at Naomi. "Do they know I am not a student?" "They do?" she said. "They do not seem to care." He smiled a little. "I want to send them another." She nodded quietly. He returned to the board, this time using blue and silver chalks borrowed from a neighbor. The shapes were smaller, but more precise. Each node had a shadow beneath it, suggesting not one plane, but two. When he was done, he titled it the Mirror Map. He did not say what it meant. A few days later, Ramirez handed in her notice. "Not because she was forced, but because she had decided something I want to teach where I do not have to explain why I believe in children," she said. She hugged Naomi and then bent to hug Miles. "I am still your teacher, even if there is no classroom." As she walked away, Miles whispered, "I am still drawing, even if there is no test." The hallway was empty again, but not silent. We would be honored to display the work of Miles Carter at the spring Congress on Number Structure and Cognition. The letter came printed on cream cardstock with a seal from the Université de Paris, tucked between a stack of mail Naomi nearly threw out. It was addressed formally to Ms. Naomi Carter, with a second line to Mr. Miles Carter. She opened it at the kitchen counter after work, her hands still raw from bleach and scrubbing. Miles watched silently from the table, where he was drawing what looked like a net folding in on itself. "They want to show your mirror map," she said after reading it twice. Miles looked at her, then at the envelope, then at the drawing, still unfinished. "Can we send another one?" he asked. "Not that one. You want to replace it?" "I want to add to it." The next day, Naomi asked her supervisor for time off without pay. They couldn't afford it, but some things could not be measured in wages. Miss Ramirez, though no longer on staff, offered to help coordinate the shipping with the professor in France. The exhibit is part of a gallery on intuitive representations of mathematical order, she explained over the phone. They've never had a contributor under the age of 15, let alone someone self-taught. He's not self-taught, Naomi corrected quietly. He's world-taught. In the weeks that followed, Miles began to draw what he called the Echo Map. It was a companion to the Mirror Map, but wider, more fragile. The loops were longer, the branches thinner, but they arched in mirrored sympathy. He used pale chalks, gray and soft yellow, like breath on a window. He spent hours on the floor, surrounded by quiet. Naomi began to understand that what he was drawing wasn't just math. It was the space between questions. It was what remained when words failed. Sometimes he muttered to himself, single words: divide, invert, return. At other times, he just hummed. At school, no one spoke to Naomi directly. But she noticed how some teachers glanced longer at her in the hallway. Some nodded. One even stopped her to say, "That boy of yours, he's different, isn't he?" She only smiled. Miss Ramirez still checked in weekly and sent updates on the French team's progress. Once, she showed Naomi a picture of the exhibit hall. Long walls, bright light, names of countries on glass panels, and somewhere in the far corner, 2 drawings in quiet colors. No labels, no explanations. "They said it stopped people mid-step," Ramirez whispered. "Like a sound you couldn't hear, but felt." A month later, Miles received an official letter in French, translated on a slip of paper by the professor himself, inviting him as a featured guest to speak briefly, if he wished, or simply to attend and observe. "I don't speak French," Miles said. "You speak numbers," Naomi replied. "That's older than French." He laughed quietly. "Do you think I have to say something?" "No," she said. "Just be there. That's enough." The week before the drawing was packed, Naomi let Miles choose the tube and padding materials carefully. They rolled it slowly and gently like a sacred object. Miss Ramirez took it to the courier herself. "I'll make sure it gets there," she said, her voice steady. Afterward, Naomi sat at the window with her tea. "You know," she said gently, "when I was your age, I used to think miracles had to be loud. To shake the ground or light up the sky. Did you stop believing in them?" "No," she said. "I just started looking lower." Miles smiled and went back to the board. The Echo Map hung beside the Mirror Map in a quiet corner of the Paris gallery, both unsigned. Only a small note printed beneath them read, "On loan from Miles Carter, age 13, Linwood, United States." The conference welcomed scholars from 30 countries. One afternoon, during a quiet walk through the exhibit, a visiting professor from Kyoto stood before Miles's drawing for over 20 minutes, saying nothing. Then she turned to her colleague and whispered, "He's not trying to prove a theorem. He's showing how numbers sleep." Later, that comment made its way into a blog post by a French graduate student titled "The Geometry of Silence." Back home, Miles sat on the floor, chalk dust on his sleeves, drawing with his left hand for the first time. He was not trying to write. He was trying to listen. He paused often now, not from uncertainty, but because he had begun to wait. He waited for the shapes to arrive instead of reaching for them. One afternoon, a letter came from a professor in Spain who had seen the exhibit. He wrote, "I do not understand your son's work completely. That is why I believe it is important, not because it is finished, but because it speaks beyond language." Naomi folded that letter and tucked it into her Bible. In a drawer next to Miles's board were dozens of smaller sketches, some half-finished, some just spirals with question marks. Naomi once asked if he was going to throw them out. "No," Miles said. "They're pieces of something. even if they don't know what yet. One of them had a single sentence scrawled in the margin. If math had dreams, maybe they would look like this. Outside, spring had come. The first light filled the window gently but steadily. Miles stood at the board again, not drawing, not writing, just standing, waiting. Let him present as an independent contributor, not as a student who failed. That was the message from the International Mathematical Institute in Paris. It came by email, followed by a signed letter from the committee overseeing the Spring Congress. Naomi read it twice. The wording was formal, precise. But one phrase stood out. We believe that genius should not be measured solely by institutional progress. It must also be seen in insight. Miles sat beside her, quiet as always. He did not smile. He rarely did in moments like these, but his fingers tightened just slightly on the edge of the table. That was how Naomi knew it mattered to him. He was invited, not as a student, not as a guest of someone else, but as himself. Miss Ramirez returned that week to help translate the details. Though no longer a teacher, she remained Miles's fiercest advocate. She arranged the virtual session for Miles to present, a 5-minute recorded presentation that would play during the Intuition in Number Structure segment of the conference. Naomi helped him pick out a shirt. Ramirez helped him practice speaking. But in the end, it was Miles who chose not to say much at all. I don't want to explain, he said. You don't have to, Naomi replied. You just have to be there. On the day of the recording, they used the school library. Ramirez had borrowed the space quietly with permission from a friend still on staff. They set up a camera, a whiteboard, and Miles. He walked in carrying only a piece of chalk. The room was empty except for Naomi and Ramirez. Outside, the hallway buzzed with end-of-day noise, but inside it was still. Miles stood at the board, drew a spiral, then a second, thinner one, then lines, linking the two. Arrows, circles, letters, not equations, gestures, movement. He didn't look at the camera. He looked at the chalk as if it might disappear. And then he spoke. Just one sentence. I see things move before I know why they move. Then he stepped back. The video lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds. When it ended, Ramirez sent it to the Paris team. They responded within an hour. It will open the session. No edits needed. The week the video played, Miles was back home. He didn't ask to watch it. He didn't need to. Naomi did, though. Twice. She sat in the quiet with her tea, hearing his voice played through a $1,000 projector in a city she would never see. She heard a room of scholars go silent. Later, a researcher from Zurich emailed to ask if he could use the drawing in a talk about emergent systems. Another from Cape Town sent a scanned version with small annotations scribbled across it, trying to map it onto symmetry theory. None of them asked for a proof, only access, permission. Can I say yes? Naomi asked Miles. Yes, he said, if they don't call it mine. I'm just listening to it too. The drawing now had a name. Not from Miles, but from a journalist who wrote a short piece in Le Monde about the boy from Linwood. They called it The Listening Spiral. Back in Linwood, the school board held a quiet meeting. There was talk of revisiting the admissions criteria for the advanced math track. A few teachers lobbied for including observational forms of proof, but the conversation was brief. Granger did not attend. Miss Ramirez, though no longer employed, submitted a letter to the board anyway. It read, "We build walls around our definitions of brilliance, but brilliance never stays inside the lines. It leaks, it flows, it whispers in chalk." The letter was not formally acknowledged, but a copy ended up pinned to the bulletin board in the teacher's lounge where someone had underlined the word whispers. The next week, Naomi received a package from Paris. Inside was a printed book, a gallery compilation of the Spring Congress. On page 19, 2 images filled the spread, the mirror map and the echo map. Below them was a caption, "Drawings by Miles Carter, no formal academic affiliation." Miles ran his finger over the page. "It's weird," he said, "seeing it not on a board." "Do you like it?" Naomi asked. "I like that it's quiet," he said. That night he sat again at the blackboard. This time he drew only dots, then lines, then more dots. "What is it now?" Naomi asked softly. "Nothing," he said. She started to turn away, but he added, "Or maybe the beginning of a new alphabet." Outside, the wind passed gently through the trees. It was a soft evening. Inside, a boy sat with chalk in his hand, writing a language no one had taught him, in a classroom that never asked him to speak. And slowly, he began to draw again. The room was small, just off the side of the conference center in Paris. Not grand. Not the kind of space people expected to witness something rare, but the chairs were full, and a quiet tension hummed in the air. On the screen, the image of a whiteboard appeared. Not clean, not symmetrical. Just a smudge of dust and a boy's hand holding a piece of chalk. The video began to play. No introduction, no music. Just lines forming, slowly, carefully. A double spiral, then a wave, then arrows curling into themselves. The boy never looked up. And then he said, clearly but softly, "I see things move before I know why they move." It lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds. When the screen went dark, the room did not clap. It stayed still. Then the moderator, an older woman with silver hair, stood and said, "Sometimes we do not applaud because the sound might erase the moment." Miles did not see this live. He was at home, folding laundry with Naomi. But his drawing, his moment, had entered the rooms he had never walked into. The following day, the drawing appeared projected during a keynote on emergent structures in unsupervised systems. A professor from Montreal gestured to the diagram and said, "This was made not by a machine nor a trained theorist, but a child, and it mimics the flow diagrams our AI systems attempt to learn through thousands of iterations." Back in Linwood, Naomi got calls, emails, all asking for access to the new drawing Miles had begun, the one he called the beginning of an alphabet. "What should I tell them?" she asked him. "Tell them it's not done listening yet." At night, Miles drew by the light of a single desk lamp. The lines grew thinner, more deliberate. Sometimes he erased, sometimes he didn't. He whispered to himself occasionally. Return, skip, fold, reflect. One day he stopped drawing and instead laid out 6 sheets in a circle on the floor. Each had fragments, nothing complete. Naomi came in and stood over them. "What are they?" "Letters," he said. "To what?" "I don't know," he said. "But they belong together." Across the ocean, in the Paris Gallery, a curator added a third piece to the display beside the mirror map and the echo map. It was a print of the listening spiral, annotated by professors from 3 different countries, each in different colors, each trying to understand. They left Miles's original untitled. But at the bottom of the display, someone had written by hand, "Some things are not solved, only witnessed." The exhibit became one of the most talked-about corners of the Congress. Meanwhile, the school in Linwood released a small press notice about a local contributor to an international academic event. They did not mention he had been rejected from their advanced track. Miss Ramirez wrote a letter to the local newspaper. It ended with the words, "A boy with chalk taught a room of PhDs how to listen. What else are we missing?" It was printed on page 7. That evening, Naomi found Miles asleep on the floor, a piece of chalk still in his hand, a spiral incomplete beside him. She picked him up gently, tucked him in, and whispered, "You opened a door that did not even have a handle." And on the board in pale green the spiral waited, unfinished, but understood. "You did not qualify for this class. Miles." Those were the first words he had heard months ago. Not cruel, not even angry, just certain. Certain that the rules were fixed, and that some doors stayed closed. Now the door was open, but not because it had been unlocked, because Miles had shown them it was never real to begin with. It started with a request. The school board, after some nudging by the media and quiet conversations from alumni, decided to host an evening of recognition for local contributors to education and achievement. Naomi received the invitation in the mail, printed nicely, too nicely. She read it aloud. "To recognize Miles Carter's contributions to the international mathematics community, Linwood Regional High School would like to invite you to attend a ceremony in his honor." Miles stared at it a moment. "Do they mean the same school I couldn't get into?" Naomi folded the letter and set it aside. "You don't have to go." He didn't, and he wouldn't. Instead, the same evening the gymnasium filled with teachers and banners and applause, Miles sat outside on the steps of their apartment, holding a pencil stub and a blank sheet. Naomi sat next to him. A breeze moved gently past. The lights from the school gym lit the sky 3 blocks away. "Do you want to draw?" she asked. "No," he said. "I just want to sit with the paper a while, before it becomes something." Naomi smiled. "I understand." That night, she received a call from a professor at the Sorbonne. He was traveling to the U.S. for a lecture series and asked if he could visit the Carter home to see Miles's new work firsthand. Naomi said yes, on the condition that he bring no cameras and no reporters. When he arrived, he brought only a small notebook and 3 questions. Miles answered one, drew another, said nothing to the third. The professor left in silence. A week later, a package arrived. Inside was a note handwritten in French and English. "There is something more than logic here. It is a kind of math that does not ask to be solved. It waits to be shared." The rest of the box held 30 bound notebooks, all blank. A gift. Miles did not open any of them right away. He set them in a stack, and that night returned to the chalkboard. But he didn't draw. He cleaned it, gently, slowly. Naomi watched from the couch, blanket in her lap. "Starting over?" "No," he said, letting it rest. Summer came, then the start of a new school year. Naomi didn't push. She worked mornings and spent afternoons cooking. Miles read quietly or sat on the fire escape watching clouds. One day he asked, "Do you think I'll ever be a teacher?" Naomi smiled. "You already are." He nodded, but he meant something more. 3 months later, he asked if he could teach other kids to draw the way he did. Not copy, not trace, but to listen to the shapes. Naomi asked around. A local library let them borrow the basement room on Saturday mornings. She cleaned the space. Bought extra chalk. Miles brought paper and string and soft pencils. The first Saturday, only 2 kids came. One was 7, the other 10. By the 3rd week, 6 more, then 12. He never taught equations, only questions. What do you see before the shape forms? What would it sound like if you could hear it? Can you draw without trying to control it? Naomi sat in the back with her coffee. Every once in a while, she'd see a child stop, tilt their head, and draw something no one else in the room had imagined. By winter, the library printed a flyer, Saturday Spirals, a listening math circle led by Miles Carter. They never called it a class. He never gave homework. But every child left with a drawing, and every drawing carried something only they could have found. At home, Miles kept drawing, but less frantic, less searching. One night, Naomi asked why. "Because the shapes are quieter now," he said. And then he smiled. Not big, not proud. Just enough. Because he had finally heard them answer back. Not a test, a way of seeing. And now, a way of giving it away. The chalk still rested in his hand. But now, so did the world. Miles never became famous in the way newspapers like to write about. He was not a headline. He was not a child prodigy turned millionaire or a quiz show champion. But across small libraries, quiet math circles, and quiet corners of the world, his drawings kept moving. Some ended up in footnotes of research papers, others in art shows. One was tattooed onto the arm of a young mathematician in Berlin, not because it solved something, but because it said something she had felt all her life and never knew how to write. Naomi kept the original chalkboard, hung it in their hallway above a line of potted plants. "That's where the world started," she'd say to guests. And on certain Saturdays when the morning light was just right, children still came, still sat cross-legged on the floor, still listened to the quiet between numbers. It was never about right or wrong, never about solving. It was about seeing and waiting and honoring what arrived. To the mothers who wipe down desks and wipe away tears, to the teachers who stay after the meeting ends, to the children whose minds don't fit test forms, but fit the shape of something we haven't named yet. To the listeners, the waiters, the ones who carry chalk in their pockets, and to the quiet rooms where everything begins. Thank you.